everyone, and welcome to Politics in the Pub. My name is Liz Morrison. I'll be your host this evening, and thanks for coming out tonight. Can you guys hear me up the back? Great, amazing. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I would love to share, especially at the moment, that the Australia Institute is proud to support the yes vote. The referendum is in just a couple of weeks on October 14. So please inform yourselves if you haven't. I encourage everyone to go and read the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We have some copies of it at the back of the room if you want something to hold in your hands and read in paper. It's a remarkable piece of writing and it doesn't take long. I personally will be voting yes. Just a few housekeeping things to get through before we get started. A reminder that drinks are available at the bar up the back, and downstairs are some really delicious food vendors. So if you're hungry, stick around for dinner afterwards. And thanks to Verity Lane for letting us come back for another Politics in the Pub. We love hosting it here. So please let's show them how much we appreciate it. And please consider supporting the Australia Institute if you can. We love making these events free for everyone to attend, but they're not free to host and run. And so if you can, please chip in a couple of dollars. It really makes a big difference to our ability to do the work. So this evening, we'll be diving into Climate of the Nation 2023, written by Elizabeth Morrison, who is me. Nice to see you guys. Just have to plug myself on that one. Thank you so much. Climate of the Nation is the longest running community survey of attitudes to climate change in Australia. And this is the 16th year running of the Australia Institute's Climate of the Nation. Every year we ask questions about everything from Australians' favourite type of electricity, it's renewables by the way, to their perception of how many people are employed by the fossil fuel industry, to their opinions about Australia's climate policies. And this year, for the first time, we asked some questions about cost of living. It's on the front of all of our minds, and Climate of the Nation showed that Australians, even with the cost of living crisis, remain really concerned about climate change. And they're drawing the links between how climate change will make cost of living worse. I am probably preaching to the choir here, but did you guys know that climate change affects everything? As it turns out, most of us did, and none more so than our brilliant panellists this evening. We're lucky to be joined by some of the leading experts of climate change in the country. It is my pleasure to welcome Richard Dennis, Executive Director of the Australia Institute, Jenny Dowell, who was the Mayor of Lismore City Council from 2008 to 2016 and is a Deputy Team Leader in the Red Cross Emergency Services in Lismore. And Dr Graeme Palmer, who owns a small business in Lismore with his wife Janice and is a science and engineering lecturer at Southern Cross University. Let's make them all feel welcome. So Jenny, if I can start with you, our audience might recognise the name Lismore from some pretty alarming climate news. Can you tell me a bit how climate change has affected your community?
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for having us here. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians. I come from Bundjalung country, the Widjabul Waiable people. Lismore is known colloquially, the CBD, as the Wok. It's in the lowest, it's in a basin surrounded by hills, and the Aboriginal people have talked for a long time about why the hell did white people decide to build there. And there are stories that floods in generations past had come up to the Cathedral Hill, which is the Catholic Church's hill. You may have seen some iconic photos of a statue of Mary with the water up halfway up Mary. And this is on a hill in Lismore. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and their knowledge of the river and land. Look, Lismore people have been through a devastating flood. Lismore is a flood-prone city, and it has been for, as long as it's been settled. Lismore people feel very strongly that they can cope with floods. So last year, on September the 21st, Lismore people went home from their businesses in the CBD rubbing their hands together and feeling that they had done everything they could. There were all hands on deck. Everything was raised up to the second floor of the buildings. I was chair of the conservatorium at that stage, which was right in the CBD. We raised all our instruments up to the second floor. Everyone went home and had a quiet beer, sat in their backyard, said, look, almost like bring it on. And people in their homes around Lismore were prepared too. In the areas that were flooded, they moved their cars to higher ground. They moved everything from downstairs up. This flood was more than 2 metres higher than anything that they'd experienced before. So it went into the living areas of houses that had been raised up, well above previous flood levels. And the devastation was enormous. Not only that, there were areas of Lismore, like East Lismore, that had never, ever flooded before. So those people woke up in the middle of the night, took a step out of bed and found floodwater in their houses, and they lost cars and things that they didn't ever expect to move. So climate change is real in Lismore. Extreme flooding events are absolutely real. Now, I'm not saying that everyone recognises those extreme flooding events as directly related to climate change, but increasingly there's awareness that the climate is changing and that these events are likely to become more frequent. So that it leads to all sorts of other things. But can I say, if no other message that I can convey tonight sticks in your mind, can I say Lismore is still in dire straits. It will take at least 7 years for our community to recover. At the moment, my reading of it is we are in the depths of despair. Mental health and anguish about this flood and the future are at its lowest ebb, and it's going to, not everyone, but it's going to take a long, long time to climb out of that. So that kind of experience means that people are deeply concerned about when will this happen again? They're also concerned, many people, about the bushfire risk that's coming up and what does our future look like. So it's real and tangible.
Absolutely. And Graeme, you know that better than anyone. What happened to your business when the floods hit?
So a good summary would be approximately half the stock value lost to the water. Sorry, it's not loud enough.
I think that's better, yeah.
Sorry. Half the stock value down the river. Possibly, I estimate something like $75,000 worth of repairs to the building. On top of that, another, a more modest sum, probably $5,000 or $10,000 replacing lost fixtures and fittings and so forth. The $5,000 photocopier went. I think we had 5 PCs associated with tills and other uses. We lost 3 of those. I think the tally up at the end of June last year, when we did the financial report for the taxman, the loss of stock, building repairs, loss of business was $473,000 to that point, and I'm about 70% back, 80% back.
Yeah, and the price of insurance went up, right? Climate of the Nation 2023 shows that 75% of Australians are really concerned about climate change and its impacts on rising costs of insurance. Can you give us a little bit of detail about how that has affected you?
Well, ahead of the event this week or today, I took a quick look at the history of payments to the insurance company that we use, and found that so my wife and I went into the shop after my dad passed away back in 2016-15. And the first year of payment was 2017. So from 2017, we had a flood. Then 2018's premium was 50% higher than the 2017 premium. Excuse me. Then the next year was pretty much level. But then we had the Black Summer fires, I think 1920 summer. And the premium for 20 was 38% higher than the previous. Yeah. And then by the end of 22, we had to go and review the insurance thing because it was getting way out of hand. So we pursue a few options about what we were choosing to insure. So we dropped some things out. And previously we were working on a month-to-month premium payment, but found an annual lump sum was far cheaper. But despite those changes, the premium paid in 22 was 25% on the previous. So I'd say, I don't know, in rough figures, something that started out in 2017 would be about $2,800 is now over $6,000. So, and that's just the way insurance works.
Yeah, absolutely. And Richard, to come to you, how are the fossil fuel companies faring amongst all of this while people like Graeme are struggling with back-to-back climate disasters and now cost of living?
Look, causing climate change has never been more profitable. The fossil fuel industry last year made around $140 billion in profit. So it's a really good time to be causing climate change. And Australia is a great country to do it in because around half of the gas we extract pays no royalties. Our petroleum resource rent tax collects almost no tax. And we've got enormous fossil fuel companies like Chevron paying literally zero in tax. So profits are at record highs. And I think what we need to understand is that fossil fuels don't just drive climate change, they drive cost of living crises because their profits are up and so are your electricity bills and so are your insurance bills and so are food prices. So yeah, unfortunately, as we're hearing tonight, this is not some abstract thing that happens in the future, and it's not something that just happens to other countries that we should feel a bit concerned about. But let's face it, it's not us. No, it's us right now. We've got climate refugees in Lismore. We've got a fossil fuel funded energy crisis and cost of living crisis right now. And there are communities that will become uninsurable. And to make that simple for you, if you can't get insurance for a house, you can't get a mortgage for a house. Right? And this is not some abstract thing that might happen in decades' time. This is happening in Australia right now.
Jenny, Richard mentioned climate refugees in Lismore. Do you care to unpack that a little bit for us tonight?
In our flood affected areas, which is several thousand homes, about 25% of those homes are now derelict. Some have been already demolished because they'd washed off their blocks, off their foundations. They were unsafe to live in. Those people have to go somewhere. We've still got hundreds and hundreds of people in emergency accommodation from as far away as Brisbane right down the New South Wales coast. Some of those are in motels and hotels, some are in pod villages. Those people, on the whole, were renters. Not all though, some are home owners who could not move back. 800 lost, but we've had a gain of about 300 moving in. We won't know until the next census exactly what. We may know beforehand a little bit, but we really don't know because some people are still registered at the homes that they're no longer living in and they are still paying mortgages on, rates on, water bills on, but their home is unlivable. So we've got a lot of flood refugees, which are in fact climate change refugees. And so we can't just think about this being a Pacific Nations thing on islands that are low-lying. This is actually happening and it's real in our community. That has, I won't go into it a great deal, but that has huge social implications. If people are staying in a community but they're seeing the community around them disappear. It's tragic, and there's no clear path forward at this stage.
Yeah, Graeme, we had a little bit of a chat earlier, but I'd love to bring that to the crowd tonight. We were talking about how it's really hard for the residents in Lismore to know what the future there looks like, and that makes it hard for them to make plans for the future. What does the future look like in Lismore if there are more back-to-back floods or fires? We're about to head into what could be a really catastrophic summer for climate change. We just had the hottest July ever. Things have not been looking good, but they especially don't look good now for climate change. What does that look like in Lismore?
Oh, great question. It's interesting because one of the things that annoys me the most is there's limited debate or discussion about what the future needs to look like. So if I was to speculate, I've already seen the people in the business district where we have our shop take steps in the rebuild to substantially improve the resilience of the buildings, the infrastructure. So everything's now waterproof. There's it's all polished cement, stainless steel, and fibro. So I'm reasonably confident that when and if it comes again, when it comes again, the losses will be much reduced because people have learned, and that's good. The thing that really is important is the one Jenny refers to is about people and where they're going to live. And I can see the very great sense in moving people out of the flood district to higher ground. But the discussion of that, how it's going to be done, where it's going to be, I think these are issues that politically are a little bit hot potato, and many of our state, maybe local government people are not sort of going there because it's particularly fraught, isn't it? But as I was talking today, this future is upon us. We're not going to escape it. The best we can do, I believe, is to be pragmatic, face the music, build your stores, build your capacity. So when it comes again, and it will come again, you just need that germ, a little bit of germ, and you'll grow again. So you mentioned about the frequency thing, and this is probably what has my wife and I most concerned about. So we took on the shop in the beginning of 2017, and there was a flood equal to the record prior 6 weeks later. So we were into the shop, eyes open, and we had, fortunately, because we were in the latter part of our careers, we had some, stores, cash or whatever. So that flood wiped that all out, but necessarily we could come back. So 5 years later, you admit, Jenny, the town responded really well, and 5 years later, I would say we were nearly back to normal or what it was. But of course, as you mentioned, this one, 2.4 metres or 2 metres greater than ever before. I grew up there. I've been through floods since, and the 74 flood was my record previous, and I had it in my head that, like, wow, this has got to be some kind of limit. So when we were packing ahead of the event, for me it was like 13 metres, everything above that, laughing. However, as Jenny pointed out, my wife woke me at 4:30 on the Saturday morning and told me that it had gone 2 metres higher, or 1.4 metres over that 13, which basically meant all we had, principally all we had went underwater. It was seismic, like you just don't, I can't tell you the words that comes when someone tells you that, a third of a lifetime, not half of a lifetime's wealth is gone. So back to the point, what's the future like? I'm not really sure. I'm confident we need to get people's living spaces up out of the water because that's just sensible, safe. I would think the commercial areas can probably survive it because they can build and structure things to endure. But I want to make the point, the discussion of these issues and how we move there needs to start straight away. And the political washing that keeps going on is just stopping people getting on with it.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Richard, to come to you next. We've been talking a lot about how people like Graeme are paying for the impacts of climate change. So I'm going to ask you about one of your favourite topics, tax. How do we tax the fossil fuel industry effectively and help move the burden of climate change to fossil fuel industries?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Well, what we do is we have to tax the fossil fuel industry effectively. Like it's not rocket science. We had a carbon price. We don't. We proposed a mining tax. A government fell over it. Australia is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. Qatar is the second largest exporter. Qatar collects 20 times more tax on gas than we do. We export more gas than them. They collect 20 times more tax on their gas than we do. So it's frustrating as an economist to talk about this because the question of, how, well, you have a go at it. It's just not complicated. How do you tax income? You impose income tax. How do you tax goods and services? You create a goods and services tax. How do you tax the fossil fuel industry? See the pattern? You put a tax on the fossil fuel industry. Right? It's not beyond our wit. But in Australia, and absolutely we need to think about, and of course the bushfire people, victims down on the south coast, still living in temporary housing. Lismore, people still living in temporary housing. Australia, one of the richest countries in the world, third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world. When the climate change we cause happens, we're not only surprised by it, we're not even in a position where we're willing to help the people that are victims of exactly what we've known as coming for decades. So it's about a willingness to do it. And of course, that raises a question, why aren't we willing? And one of the main reasons is in Australia, we've been convinced ourselves that we somehow can't live without the fossil fuel industry. We've convinced ourselves it's somehow the backbone of our economy, and that without the backbone of economy, we'll have nothing. Now, to give you a sense of this, there's about 195 countries in the world, and most of them have no mining industry. Spineless bastards. How does their economy work? How do other countries exist? How have we internalized the idea that without one industry, we're nothing, when most countries don't even have that thing? Or the countries that do have that thing, that are wealthy because of it, are wealthy because they tax it, not because they have it, but because they tax it. And as we report in Climate of the Nation, one of the key results is that in Australia, the average Australian, not you're heaps smarter than average, but the average Australian thinks 11% of people work in the coal industry. 11%? It's 0.3%. 0.3%. Right, about 50,000 people. McDonald's employs 100,000. And when I say this, and I say it a lot, I say it on radio, I get attacked for, that's nonsense. McDonald's don't employ 100,000. Yeah, they do. Oh, but no buts. It doesn't employ many people. The average Australian thinks 10% of people work in coal and in oil and gas. 0.2%. 20,000 people work in oil and gas. It's trivial. Right? There are hospitals that big. There are unis that big. But in Australia, we actually, not you, but everyone else, believes that somehow if it shut down tomorrow, brackets, no one's ever said shut it down tomorrow. Right? The question is, why are we still growing it? Why is it still expanding? But the idea is that if it shut down tomorrow, we'd all lose our jobs. No, we wouldn't. And here's the kicker. You know why the Reserve Bank has been increasing interest rates for the last year? To cause unemployment. To make people lose their jobs, right? Because we're worried about inflation and we're worried that the economy's overheated. So we've got the Reserve Bank literally increasing interest rates to slow economic growth, to cause unemployment. And apparently the only reason we need to keep burning the planet is to create jobs. Well, could someone have a chat and sort this out? Because the RBA is trying to cause unemployment, yet we're told we have to cause climate change to create jobs. I mean, this is nonsense, right? And every economist in the country knows it's nonsense. But as long as the public think that between coal and gas, 20% of Australians work in fossil fuels, 20%. People think 20% of us work in fossil fuels. Well, that's why they have political power to not just expand, but to pay no tax while they're causing this harm. So step one, we need to stop making the problem worse. The bath's overflowing. Here's a tip, turn the tap off. All right, and then we need to clean up the mess. And if we didn't spend 11 billion a year subsidising the fossil fuel industry and we didn't let them pay no tax, we'd have plenty of money. Absolutely plenty of money. We're one of the richest countries in the world.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, Climate of the Nation this year shows that 2 in 3 Australians know that tackling climate change in the regions has huge opportunities for jobs and investment. So there's really a lot of political impetus, and these renewable energies and renewable energy industries are popular and will create more jobs, and Australians know it. Jenny, I wanted to ask you about a job that you've had in the past. You worked in emergency services for a while. Can you tell us a bit about what that was like in Lismore?
Yeah, look, I've been an emergency responder for 3 or so years. So I've been heavily involved in this flood event and continue to be. So that emergency response came from the Sunday night before the flood peaked, where we were getting the first lot of people who had been self-evacuated from homes in the flood zone. So they came in dry and worried, but safe. And overnight, by the next morning, we were getting people coming in who were wet, weeds in their hair because they'd been clinging for hours to a telephone pole, or they had been on the roof of their house waiting to be rescued all night. So for up to 12 hours until daylight and boats started, civilians started to rescue them. And of course, those rescue boats couldn't get everyone at once. So people were coming in terrible, terrible conditions. And these are people of all ages, some of whom brought in their dog that they'd managed to save or their chook that they'd managed to save. It was absolutely terrible. So these people came in literally with their clothes wet on their back, and that is it. So that rescue and recovery went on for quite a few days, and our emergency centres were full of people sleeping on the floor, on mattresses and whatever. So, and of course, one of the challenges in that is to reunite people who've been separated. People were coming in trying to find their elderly parents because phone links went out, phone batteries were dead, but we had no phone links. For some time we had no electricity either. So it was a really tense period, and one of the roles for emergency services is to reassure people that you are safe now. You are here, we will look after you. You are safe now, to take the edge off that terrible distress. Those rescues went on for days. The army was literally cutting people out of ceiling cavities to winch them in helicopters out. That went on for days. So we were still having people rescued for days. So that was the emergency response. It went on quite some time. To remember that a month later, we had another flood. So people who'd gone back to their homes or were somewhere were flooded again. Some people, some of the businesses had already restored and were back operating. And the flood happened again a month later. So that was traumatic again. Some of the businesses that hadn't bothered were pleased that they hadn't bothered to rush to repair, because, well, what more damage can another flood do? So that period went on. Between the two floods, we were starting for some early recovery. That early recovery in the recovery centre, where people are linked with government agencies and other services, had to be put on hold when we went back into emergency response again. So it's been horrendous, and the recovery period is still continuing now, with a lot of psychological support, as well as and a lot of this is volunteer driven. We've got fabulous volunteer agencies that are helping people build walls within their homes. There's a two rooms project to get walls back in rooms that you've got two livable rooms. There are still people living in a tent behind their house without a usable toilet, still 19 months after the flood. So it's been a long journey, and I know you asked about the emergency response, but we're fearful of another event that will plunge us back into that.
Yeah, absolutely. And given the approaching summer and potential bushfire season, I can totally imagine how that you must be preparing for that as well. Graeme, we've been talking a lot about the personal impacts that it's had on you and on Jenny and on Lismore. I wanted to ask you a little bit more a zoom out question. You're a scientist. How does it make you feel when your community is ravaged by a climate disaster that scientists have been saying is going to happen, and people are still not acting on climate?
Sorry, it is a. You can imagine it's the first reports go back to the 50s, I believe. The first report that gained any level of interest in the press was 74, I think. This is climate change I'm talking about. So yes, it's been going on for years, hasn't it? And people have been talking about it, warning about it, and nothing's been done. I suppose was it businesses that profit from this managed it quite well. I think the thing that probably frustrates me the most now is, so I work for the university in forestry, and amongst various things I teach, I also have a great interest in biomaterials and bioenergy. So I know, for example, the technology that we need to produce, for example, high energy liquid fuels to fly jets or what have you, exists. The technologies that could be implemented to draw down and store carbon exists in forests, of course. So I think the most frustrating thing is many of the answers that we need to implement to answer these challenges exist. But each day you see the greenwashing in the press, you see the avoidance of the question, all these things go on, I suppose, to prolong the status quo. And that, I suppose, as a scientist, is the most frustrating of all, because there's no language, there's no statement to the press that you seem to be able to generate to shift the work of people and the work of the country in a direction that can get us out of here. Australia's big enough to make a serious contribution to the capture and storage of carbon from the atmosphere. It's literally like there's thousands of square kilometres of New South Wales and Queensland that could be doing that right now. So the opportunities we have are like really plain. I don't see it as, there are still some technical challenges there. I won't bore you with the detail, but necessarily I think the risks are low. So yes, how do I feel? Sometimes you just want to punch someone.
Thank you so much for that explanation. Really appreciate it. We're going to go to audience questions in just a minute. There's a microphone up the front, so please walk on up and line up to ask your question after I have one more question for Richard. I'm going to spit off some facts from Climate of the Nation and then get to my question. About half of us think the government isn't doing enough on climate. Majority of us support no new fossil fuels in line with advice from the International Energy Agency. And we know that fossil fuels will make it harder to hit our 43% emissions reduction target. And an overwhelming majority, more than 3/4 of us, say that climate policy should be based on best practice climate science. Which, if you're wondering, says we need a really rapid transition to renewable energy yesterday. So Richard, what's the holdup?
The holdup is purely politics. The holdup is purely the, to date, inability of our democratic structures to take advice from scientists, to take the attitudes of voters, to take the international obligations we've made and turn them into policy that drives change. Like, this is a unique, so people talk about climate change being a wicked problem. Isn't it a nasty problem? It's the problem that's wicked, not the fossil fuel industry. It's the problem that's wicked. Or you hear people say, oh, the problem with climate change, it's a wicked problem, wicked, nasty little problem. Not the people, the problem, because the costs are up front, and the benefits are in the future, and the benefits are uncertain, and Australia acting by itself can't solve the whole problem. So this is a uniquely hard democratic problem, some people suggest, right? Because the costs are today and people don't like paying for things, and the benefits are in the future, and that's a bit hard to sell. This is in a country that just dropped a lazy $300 billion on nuclear submarines. $300 billion for new subs. And by the way, another lazy $300 billion for the stage 3 tax cuts. No economic modelling, no scientific clamour, no public clamour, nothing. Just the previous government felt like doing it, and the current government felt like agreeing with it would help them win an election. Democracy. There's nothing in the Constitution said we should be far-sighted. There's nothing in the Constitution says we should make good decisions. No, but I mean, like, let's own this, right? The Constitution just comes up with rules for how we elect people and what the limits of powers are. There's nothing in there about what we should do with this. That's up to us. That's up to democracy. And to date, the small fossil fuel industry has been incredibly effective at convincing the large population and the overwhelming scientific body that we shouldn't rush, we shouldn't do this, we should wait for magical technologies. By the way, carbon capture and storage exists. It's called the tree. And by the way, we subsidise logging. And Graham's spot on about what we could be doing in New South Wales and Queensland. But you know what we're doing in New South Wales and Queensland? Still land clearing. We're still bulldozing this stuff. Well, we're subsidising native forest logging in Tasmania right now. So why? Well, you know, I think not because of you, but because that person sitting next to you votes wrong. Or, I know, right? It's not you, so it must be everyone else. It's called reverse psychology. So yeah, unfortunately, we actually just have to own that this is not some complicated economic problem. It's simple. It's not some complicated scientific problem. It's simple. It's not that you're alone in thinking we should do something and the overwhelming majority think it. This is just what we've lacked to date, is the ability to cohesively turn this intention into action, in part because the fossil fuel industry just made $140 billion causing the problem. They're not going to lay down. They're not going to stop. They're betting that person sitting next to you is apathetic. So, and that's the problem. Like, this problem is not beyond democracy or economics or science to fix. It's just currently beyond the ability of Australians to organise in a way that takes on the power of the fossil fuel industry, that doesn't employ many people and doesn't pay a lot of tax, but causes cost of living crisis and climate change. So get that person next to you to sort their shit out.
And on that note, can that person sitting next to you come up and ask a few questions? Yeah, please come up to the front if you have a question.
Good evening. John Schilling's my name, from Canberra. I've got a really subversive question that I've been asking around the place for a long time, and it's this. Why are we still using the expression net zero? Because it's neither net nor zero. The Australia Institute spent a day at Parliament House, I attended in February, I think, persuading us very cogently that offsets were either precarious, unstable, or mostly outright fraudulent. So if there are no such thing as offsets, how can there be such a thing as net zero? Should we not be educating the public out of thinking, you know, formula, net zero? Should we not be educating them to think irreducible minimum emissions and the constant striving for that? I mean, Richard mentioned trees. Well, trees are biological, not mineral sequestration.
Yeah.
And they always give it back to the atmosphere in the end.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to start on this, Richard, and then I'll throw in some Climate of the Nation numbers at the end?
Yeah, sure. And I reckon Graham might have something to say as well. Look, absolutely. I mean, the reason that we at the Australia Institute do simple things like remind people we're still building new coal and gas is because what the fossil fuel industry wants you to do is think that something complicated like net zero with offsets is doing something. Like, we actually just have to keep our eye on the prize. The science is simple. The way you reduce emissions is to, stick with me here, reduce emissions. So if emissions are going up, here's a tip, they're not going down. And I hate to say it, a lot of people love to get excited about timelines and targets and modelling and accounting rules. But you know what? If they're still going up, we're just losing. Right? And until they start going down, frankly, I don't even care about targets for 2050 or 20, because if they're still going up, it's all nonsense. So yeah, net zero, you won't hear me talking about it. What do we need to do? We need to stop building new coal mines. We need to shut down coal-fired power stations. We need to stop chopping down trees, and offsets ain't going to fix nothing. It's not complicated. But the people that want to maintain the status quo want it to feel complicated. It's not an accident. These are smart people who just made $140 billion, which is more than all of us combined, I reckon.
Speak for yourself. Thanks. Do you have anything to add, Graeme?
Oh, you mentioned the tree thing, and of course, it's a biological material, and it's part of the carbon cycle. And yes, naturally, it would return to the atmosphere to be absorbed again in the photosynthesis function. But you can imagine, a few gigatons of carbon being stored as wood in the biosphere for the next 100, 150 years, which would, I think, considering that temporal aspect, that's probably a pretty reasonable contribution to solving the problem.
Yeah, and just to throw some Climate of the Nation stats in there for everyone, just 1 in 4 of us correctly understand net zero. So that means the fossil fuel companies that are throwing it around everywhere are doing a really good job of convincing us that net zero makes a real contribution to climate change. But the good news is that 2 in 3 of us think that the government should be policing net zero claims and making sure that they are better regulated and do a better job of reducing emissions. Next question. Thank you.
So you mentioned how we basically have no version of a fossil fuel tax, and along with the controversial stage-free tax cuts and all these other not so well-placed subsidizations, how much, in a broad sense, how much money is Australia actually sitting on and not using at all due to shoddy economic and tax structures?
I'll look at an enormous amount. So forget fossil fuels for a second. Australia is one of the lowest tax countries in the developed world. Right? We're one of the lowest tax countries in the OECD. We're told we're a high tax country. That's what economists call a lie. We're a low tax country. And if we were just collecting about the same percent of GST as the OECD average, we'd collect an extra $100 billion a year. That would make us an average tax country. Right? We could just have $100 billion a year to spend on schools, roads, hospitals, helping people, $100 billion per year, just if we were average in the OECD. And that doesn't even include, well, what if we got rid of $11 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies? What if we didn't have $20 billion a year in stage 3 tax cuts? What if we didn't spend $20 billion or so a year on the subs for the next decade or so? What if we had a windfall profits tax of the gas industry last year? Right. So Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, and it takes real skill and real creativity to make us feel poor. No, but it's worked, right? Go ask every NGO why we can't have better insert service here, and every NGO will tell you, oh, we don't have enough money. How good is that? We've made rich people feel poor. I'm not saying there's not poverty in Australia. I'm saying collectively, we're some of the richest people in the world. And neoliberalism has done a brilliant job of creating a deficit mentality in people's minds. There was always some shortage. Therefore, we can play the teachers off against the nurses for who gets the pay rise. We can play the environment movement off against the union movement for who gets some money in a budget. This is no accident. This is clever. This is effective. And I don't know why that person sitting next to you falls for it.
Jenny, what would a share of $100 billion mean for Lismore?
Wow. Unbelievable. For a start, we need land where people can relocate, either relocate their existing homes or build a new one. People can't afford to do that because the money they're getting from the buyback, if they get a buyback, is not enough to buy or build a new home. It's not enough to relocate their existing home. So a share of that money would make our community stick together, would allow our community to get out of risky situations, and would be money well spent rather than facing this situation again. It's not good enough to just pour money in to fix the problem without getting people into safety. So a share of that money would be wonderful, but we don't have, it's not just a money issue, it's a planning issue. We haven't got the land identified. There's so much wrong with this system. Graeme said he feels like punching someone. I feel like grabbing people and banging their heads together and saying, sort your shit out. Our community cannot wait any longer. We've got wonderful people with great minds working on this, but they're working in silos and they're not communicating to our community. So share of the money would be a great start, but let's get people talking.
I reckon Jenny swearing is going to go off on TikTok.
Thank you so much, and for the swear words. Teresa, do you want to come and ask a question?
Thank you, Liz. Aloha, everyone. My name is Teresa, and I'm from Tuvalu, which is the fourth smallest nation in the world, and on the front line advocating for the impacts of climate change. So sorry, please bear with me. I almost have an opening statement before I reach the question. So I'd like to thank you all for sharing your stories, drawn from lived experiences, research, and data. And I deeply empathize with the challenges that the Lismore community is and are currently facing, because I can actually relate to that. Being from Tuvalu. So Dr. Jenny, you mentioned that waters during the floods rose as high as 2 meters, and I can relate. Tuvalu is only a low-lying atoll, and the highest point is only 3 meters above seawater level, and that's for all our islands. So knowing that Australia is one of the biggest contributors to the emissions of fossil fuels, and as mentioned, the third country to contribute to fossil fuel emissions, and also knowing that climate change is real, I'd like to thank you for acknowledging that this is not only a Pacific climate issue, but it's everyone's concern right now, and it should be everyone's problem, and everyone should be taking action. So knowing that, and knowing that floods and other natural disasters could plague Lismore in the future, would you lean towards renewable energy, taking into account that startup resources for this at times, but correct me if I'm wrong, scientists, can be challenging depending from community to community. And I say this and I stand by this because for Tuvalu to depend on renewable energy, no donor or no country is fully committed to supporting this. That's why it hasn't been done. So would you be leaning more towards renewable energy, or would you be leaning towards no fossil fuel future, just like Tuvalu and other Pacific countries who are advocating for the non-proliferation of fossil fuels? And this is not no more new fossil fuels, this is just no fossil fuels ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And I really do acknowledge the challenges of Tuvalu and other Pacific nations. If I can just talk briefly, when I said 2 meters, that was 2 meters above the previous highest. So the total flood height was about 14.5 meters. We had the equivalent of 2 Sydney harbours amount of water go through Lismore for that flood. For us locally, it's difficult to comprehend, let alone someone who's outside our community. Graeme mentioned the 1974 flood. Throughout Lismore on the telephone poles, it was common when you had visitors to Lismore to point out the height of the blue tags on the telephone poles to show that that was the previous highest flood recorded. For this flood to be 2 meters above that is incomprehensible. Lismore 2480 postcode had, certainly when I was mayor, we were known as the postcode in New South Wales with the highest number of solar panels. We were a leader in solar panel, solar energy. We had a floating solar farm on our sewerage, the largest one at that stage in Australia. So lots of things showed that Lismore community was absolutely committed to alternative energy sources. We're not a high wind area. Our topography doesn't allow us to have wind turbines, but we're made for solar. So our community has absolutely embraced that. I'm not making any judgment what Tuvalu should do, but we as a global nation, a global player, needs to be aware that what we do and other developed nations in the world do is absolutely influencing what's happening in our Pacific neighbourhood. So I'm not a scientist. These fellows, economists and scientists, can talk about the science of it. I'm just saying that in our community and communities like ours everywhere, there is absolutely a move towards renewables. There are certainly people in our community who are not engaging about fossil fuels, but Lismore led the fight against CSG mining. That was while I was mayor, and we said we did not want it in Lismore. We've got 87% of our community overall in Lismore said no to CSG, and some of our communities were as high as 99%. So we've shown that our community is ready for alternative sources.
Let me just say, I think that's wonderful, and I guess it also highlights a really important point, that the thing about climate change is when the people of Lismore do the right thing, lead on solar, oppose fracking, when you've got jurisdictions like Western Australia, whose emissions have risen 50% in the last decade, it just doesn't matter where in the world the emissions come, the climate change will hit where it will hit, whether it's Tuvalu, whether it's Lismore. And to give you a sense of it, if there was a 17-metre flood out there now, it would be over our heads right now. 17 metres. Right? So, and look at what's happening in Greece at the moment. Look at what's happened in Libya. So, look, unfortunately, the science is really simple. And, you know, absolutely. I mean, the Australian Institute research about what to do is just based on the simple science of what's necessary. And if we are to protect people, we've got to stop talking about vulnerable people, which is we want to protect people who happen to live in the wrong town, who happen to live in the wrong country, whether it's Tuvalu or Greece, when one of these extreme events happen. If we want to do something about that, well, we know what to do. And if we put it off, we're putting more of those people in danger. And you know, and until we can organize ourselves around that, it's not going to happen. It's not going to fix itself.
Thank you. Next question.
So aside from the fossil fuel industry, I guess the question is kind of who else is profiting from climate change and inaction? We're hearing more about the emerging sector of disaster capitalism, and we've seen this in the Northern Rivers with property developers making money out of a climate-driven housing crisis. And Richard, you mentioned neoliberalism, kind of while you know, governments are failing to implement adaptation strategies, we're seeing the private sector kind of profiting from it, which then drives inequality, and the government say, oh, we don't have the capacity to kind of step in there. So I guess I'm just interested in your thoughts about the emerging sector of disaster capitalism and what we and governments need to do about it.
Yeah, look, I mean, the problem and the opportunity is the same. The fact that such a small number of people are making so much money causing the problem should make it democratically easy to fix, but there's so much concentrated wealth and power in those hands that they're a little determined to not give it up. So the overwhelming profits are to the fossil fuel industry. Yeah, I think disaster capitalism, I think, is really important to look at. And the other obvious culprit at the moment is there are now people making billions of dollars selling, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, bullshit carbon credits. Right? It's become an incredibly profitable activity to promise to not chop down a tree. It's become incredibly profitable to promise to not do a bad thing and get paid a lot of money for it. And at the moment in Australia, we're seeing the amount of money spent on carbon credits going through the roof, and not coincidentally, a complete drought of investment in renewable energy. because we've actually told ourselves that these are substitutes. You could tackle climate change by installing renewable energy, or you could tackle climate change by buying a nonsense carbon credit. So we've actually got a drought of investment in renewables and a flood of profits in the dodgy carbon credit industry. And to be clear, this is not an accident. This took effort and skill and legislative power to create. So, yeah, we do need to look around for who's profiting. We need to pay very close attention. But the short answer is not many people. They're just making such enormous profits, and that's why they're fighting to keep them.
Do you have anything to add to that, Graeme, given your background in forestry and your interest in preserving forests and photosynthesis for carbon drawdown?
Yes, the economic aspects. So I'm going to stick my hand up now and probably raise the ire of the crowd. But so we talked about carbon storage, and in my view, forests can offer an opportunity for us, the people, to capture and store carbon and use it. Forests have the opportunity to provide the materials that can display high emissions concrete and steel. Provides the opportunity to provide the raw materials to produce high energy liquid fuels that we will still need in the future if we're going to run trucks and agricultural equipment and jets. So I know the theme in the community at the moment, or in society, is that no tree should be cut. I believe no animal should lose its existence because of forest harvesting. But I think harvesting and utilisation of wood is key to the industrial solution to this problem.
And to be clear, I don't disagree. I think we need to stop subsidising native forest logging when we're turning them into wood chips. We need to produce wood and use wood well. What we're actually doing is literally trashing beautiful native forest in some parts of Australia and turning it into wood chips, or land clearing in Queensland at record quantities for low value agricultural production.
Can I add something on that? One of the greatest fears in Lismore at the moment, Lismore is the centre of the big scrub, was the centre of the big scrub rainforest, where the cedar getters settled Lismore, really, before the dairy farmers and etc. Many of our old homes that have been affected by the floods have been built from old hardwoods. The great worry in our community is that those old hardwoods that have survived the flood, absolutely survived the flood, may be trashed. And the call is for those homes, wherever possible, to be retained and moved, and where not possible, for all the materials in their homes to be salvaged. There's too much value in heritage, in all sorts of reasons, not just monetary, in those beautiful red cedars and other fine timbers that are in those homes.
Thank you so much. Next question.
Australia has 2 carbon targets in 2030 and 2050. How far are we from actually hitting these targets, and how much will we need to subsidize, the opposite to that, tax the polluters to actually meet these targets?
Look, great question. We're way off, and let's choose our words carefully again. We don't actually have any national climate policy. We have targets. We have no policy to drive change. There is no policy at the moment to encourage mass rollout of renewables at either at an industrial scale. There's no policy to stop the expansion of fossil fuel production. There's no policy to increase energy efficiency in the transport sector. There's no fuel efficiency standards. We're actually just not doing any of the simple things. And we've got a safeguard mechanism that, guess what, relies or allows you to rely 100% on offsets to meet your obligations. So the only kind of climate policy we have, the safeguard mechanism, doesn't actually impose an actual limit on any polluter. Because if you go over the limit, you can just buy some offsets. So no, we're way off track. And even if we're on track, we'd be off track because Australia's emissions targets aren't even aligned with the 1.5 degree global target. So look, the sad reality is that what Australia's still doing in 2023 is what it was doing in 2013 and 2003 and 1993 when I first heard about climate change. And that is saying, it's all right, we've got big plans for what we're going to do later. Right. And when I was in 1993, you know, when I was when I was a lot younger, 2050 was a long way away. Well, it's not that far away now. But here we are still saying, fear not, emissions are going up, but boy, one day they're going to plummet. Well, you know, I've been watching that graph with the promised plummet. Try saying that 3 times quickly. The promised plummet never comes. So and it's still going up.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, thank you for all your wonderful words of advice about Lismore. I just wish perhaps you were running the climate policy down here. About planning, I noticed that CSIRO, I believe, started mapping your catchment after the floods. Don't we really need to do that all over the country, as well as identifying the land ahead of time where people who are definitely going to be flooded can move to?
Look, that's a really good question. CSIRO is doing a study on future with modelling for mitigation, I guess, for Lismore. There are always people who believe there's an engineering solution to everything. If you look at a water catchment model of Lismore, it's multiple fingers, like 50 fingers of streams that converge on Lismore. There's a whole call about build a dam, build a new dam. And that has a great deal of traction. There's in a community, and there is a site for a dam. There's land being acquired for a dam. That's not the whole solution for a start, because you would need 50 dams on 50 fingers that come into Lismore. I've even heard people say, build a huge underground tunnel from north of Lismore to Ballina underground. It's about 30k, and get all the water pumped out. These simplistic engineering solutions are totally rubbish. We have to.
You're an engineer. Will the tunnel work?
Oh, no, the cost of that solution is it's unattainable.
Yeah.
If we had the money to build a tunnel like that, I'd probably find someone else to build it.
Yeah. So we are waiting for the CSIRO report to come out, probably sometime next year. My call to them is, tell us where you're up to. Tell us what you have ruled out. Tell us what you are investigating, because it's like this nebulous secret society and people just don't know. A lot of people are putting all their hope-filled eggs in that CSIRO bucket, whereas many people are saying we need to live with flooding, find ways of keeping people safe and getting them out of the flood zone, mitigate flooding and build resistance and resilience. I'm on the board of the Northern Rivers Conservatorium. We've put in polished concrete floors. We've ripped up all the carpet on our second floor and put the hardwood floors underneath were fabulous. We put down carpet tiles where we needed soundproofing that can be taken up. All the fixtures are stainless steel. Our walls are either glass walls or compressed polystyrene coated with cement so that everything can be hosed out. Businesses throughout Lismore are doing things like that with marine ply. It's about doing those kinds of things, not waiting for this magical solution of a saviour from an engineered solution. That's just, to my mind, naive.
Thank you so much. Next question.
G'day. I'm from a local community organisation called Suburb Zero. We're trying to do something about climate change from a local perspective. I just wanted to, we've got 150 people in the room here. What's something practical that we can actually do tomorrow that you'd like us to do to actually get some movement in the community? So we've heard about all these issues and stuff, but what's something these people can go away and do?
Well, I was going to give a plug to the People's Blockade. I don't know if you found a nice little brochure on your chair. November 24 to 27 up in Newcastle, my hometown, world's largest coal port. So, look, I actually think that as individuals, we have to think about being citizens, not consumers. We have to pay really close attention to our democracy. It's great. I love living in Canberra. I love living in a jurisdiction that already has 100% renewable electricity. Not a target for it. Like, we've got it and we achieved that some time ago, but we can go further. We can do more here. So there are things that individuals can do, but I actually would prefer to emphasise what individuals can do within their democracy, because nothing you do in your community can stop someone else causing your climate change. So, I'll leave it to others to advise you what you can do tomorrow for you. What I'd urge you to do is do things tomorrow for everybody, because you can't solve climate change by yourself. We can, but you can't.
Look, my comment was make sure that your politicians and your representatives at every level, at an individual council level, at a state level and a federal level, know that this is a big concern for you, and get your friends active as well. Politicians do not ignore, or they ignore at their peril, grassroots campaigns that take off like wildfire, and no pun intended about bushfires. CSG made our campaign, and it was like what the Teals did with kitchen cabinet kind of thing. It was a street by street active campaign that made incredible change in Lismore, and changes of attitudes in Lismore about CSG. So it's about working globally, a little bit like what's happening with the Yes campaign, conversations, and then those conversations becoming political pressure. Yes, there are dinosaurs out there. There are dinosaurs in our political, all spheres of political life. But in the end, the build-up of political pressure cannot be ignored.
Do you have any comments on that, Graeme?
That's a tough question. I said, I'm not a social scientist or economist, so it's difficult to come up with a reasonably good answer. But two things come to my mind that are short at the moment. Number one is, I think we've identified tonight that the story of the facts is not getting out there. So I think individually we all have a obligation, I suppose, to stay informed and spread the word. And that might even go as far as to influencing what's going on in the schools where your kids go, whatever forum it can take. I think we need to shift the paradigm, as it were, away from such terms as net zero to we've got to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the first thing. I guess the other, from my point of view, like, we've taken a beating at the shop, but one of the first things we did post 17 is we went out and put 44 panels on the roof of our place, and we so that's enough energy to supply power to all the tenants of the building we're in. So I went to the tenants and told them to shut down their grid connections, and they utilised because they're only there during the day, so it's not a problem. So now, that's all solar supplied. When I get the chance, should I ever have money ever again, I'm straight out. I'm going to buy an electric van for the shop. I think what I'm getting at is there's a number of things, all of them expensive, but whatever opportunity you might be able to take to move one step away from fossil fuels and one step towards the renewables, then take it.
Thanks so much. We've got a couple questions, and then we're coming up to time. So we'll take these questions and then wrap up. Thank you so much. Next question.
I don't mean, this might be a little bit cheeky, but this follows on from the democratic capture and how the facts are not really, the scientific and economic facts aren't really making much headway. So a gross simplification of history is mostly when humanity has changed at scale necessary, it was due to pestilence, disaster, economic industrial revolution, and the point of a sword. The climate science and the economics, taxation, what we should do is, that work has been done. We kind of know what to do there. And given we've ignored the point of economics, and given we've ignored pestilence of COVID and ignored the natural disasters, is it not time for the point of the sword, or at least protest and civil disobedience?
I'm anti-sword, but yeah, look, I think protest is a very important role to play in democracy. I mean, go and look at Jim Cairns in leading protests against the Vietnam War. It's not like that people in Parliament now don't look back in pride to enormous protests that have taken place in Australia before. So I'm a Democrat. I like democracy. I think that peaceful protest is very, very important. And of course, we live in one of the most oppressive democracies in the world. No, it's because of an accident. Look what happened in South Australia. There was a fossil fuel conference, the RBA conference. There were some protests, and the Parliament changed the protest laws the next day. Progressives tell themselves things like, oh, you can't get things through Parliament, never get things fixed. Yeah, bullshit. You get things fixed all the time. Powerful people get things fixed all the time. So, no, I think protest has a really important role, but just so does voting. Look at how many Liberals lost their seats at the last election. Now, the remaining ones don't seem to have learned the lesson. Well, that's good. No, that's good, right? Because that's how democracy works. And then they might have to lose their seats too. Or that person sitting next to you might win.
Thanks so much. Final question.
It was in the news today that Admiral Chris Barry had stated, along with others, that the greatest security threat to Australia, it's not China, it's climate change, because of all of the chaos that it could cause around the world. Now, it seems that I think Labor has acknowledged, yeah, that's true, but they really don't want to make much of it. And the Conservatives, I haven't heard anything from them. Maybe something will come through. You'd think that Peter Dutton is always obsessed with security, would get his attention, because he's always seeing terrorists under the beds rather than Reds under the beds. But all of the floods and fires we've had are still failing to convince people that very drastic action is necessary. Can this particular threat make any difference, or will that be put out of people's minds? I think they've got other day-to-day things to worry about. And if that's the greatest threat, what sense does it make to spend all that money on a threat, the AUKUS submarines, within not the greatest threat? Australia is so much protected by its geography that we should be spending our resources on the major issues, and the biggest issue of the lot is climate change.
Look, I'll take a stab at that. It's as if some politicians just lie. It's as if they say things like, all I want to do is maximise GDP, when they refuse to do things like make childcare free, which would boost GDP. It's as if they say things like, I'm really worried about the budget deficit, and then put $300 billion worth of tax cuts through. I hate to break it to you, but what if what they said they were trying to do and what they were really trying to do weren't the same thing? So you're right. You are absolutely right that if, and it's a big if our national security was the number one priority for these people, they'd make radically different decisions. So they're not making radically different decisions. So is it possible that they're not really obsessed with national security? Is it possible they're obsessed with maintaining the status quo, maintaining their seat in Parliament, maintaining their position in a power structure? So of course you're right. If we cared about national security, we wouldn't be dropping $300 billion on submarines, because 2 years ago, no one in the Defence Forces even thought we needed them. So I hate to break it to you, just because a politician says they're obsessed with the economy doesn't mean they are. Just because a politician says they're obsessed with national security doesn't mean they are. It just tells you that those magic words, saying them again and again, economy, national security, make the person sitting next to you vote for them. But then when they've been elected, what do they go and do? They waste money on crazy shit and cause climate change.
Thanks so
Can-
much. And
can-
we have one. Oh,
Can
do you
I
wanna
just
add?
raise something there? During the CSG debate in Lismore, my contention was that it was very difficult for politicians to see a different way if they had a relationship with a CSG company. The lobbyists for coal and fossil fuels have relationships with our politicians. They have lobbyists that work on their behalf. They have regular meetings with our politicians. It's really difficult when blurring the lines between a lobbyist who has a relationship that then becomes a friendship for that politician to say, hold on, stop there, I'm stepping back, I think you're wrong. So one of the things we have to do is break that nexus, the close relationships that fossil fuel companies and their lobbyists have with their politicians, to allow the politicians to be stronger, to listen to the Chris Barrys. I think it's wonderful when someone who's a traditionalist, if you like, particularly coming from the armed forces and others, is the person who points out that the emperor has no clothes, mixing metaphors. Whereas someone who comes from the climate change lobbyist saying those things does not get the traction. So we can break the nexus and get people who are respected from on the Conservative side to call out that the emperor has no clothes, then we've got some chance of making change.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we've got one question. Can we keep it? Yes, come ask your question, but let's keep it brief and then we'll leave it there.
Hi, I experienced the floods as well in Brisbane, so I feel the pain and the resilience. My question is, I heard that as Brisbane is approaching the Olympics Games, and a lot of labor and materials are gonna be drawn towards Brisbane, and we know that there's a labor shortage and shortages in material, etc. So that there's a context in there. We're gonna experience fires and other catastrophic events. So my question is, how is Lismore community implementing any strategy to remain relevant and up high in the priority? Because as we move in the media politically from one catastrophe to the other, do you have strategies to not be left out, especially with the Olympics and the political attention that helps growing GDP in Queensland?
I am no longer mayor. I am on the Regional Development Australia Board for the Northern Rivers. We are very well aware of supply chain shortages and job shortages. We've got, like most of New South Wales, we have a shortage of engineers, project planners, land use manager planners. Many people in commercial businesses cannot get workers. So we've already got great shortages. We have shortages in tradies, tradesmen, tradeswomen, and also supplies. So there's great delays in rebuilding. That will get worse. You're quite right with the pressures that come on. We've already seen moves from Queensland to attract tradespeople to Queensland to work on their flood, and I'm sure we will see it the same with the Olympics as well. So some sort of gentleman's agreement or women's agreement between states not to poach workers and not to poach materials might be nice. I can't see it happening, but look, there are things happening about the vision of Lismore in the future, but it's unclear to most of the community and it's piecemeal. So I think we've got a lot of chaos to go through before we see a vision and some plan.
Graeme, do you have any final comments?
On that question, sure. I guess it's important that Lismore does retain some visibility going ahead. We need the support, there's no question. However, as someone mentioned before about the CSIRO report, yes, they're looking at Lismore, but it's a national problem, isn't it? Everywhere the water flows in a river or there's trees growing that can burn, potentially in the future, a disaster might come. So the planning needs to be national. And I personally wouldn't mind if Lismore took its role or place in the national discussion. And back to the question before that, which is kind of relevant, I suppose, is it's unfortunately we have time on our side. It's coming. We've seen what's happened in the last, say, half a dozen years in terms of visibility and acceptance, and the reports outlines that. I think another half dozen years, those people that aren't currently convinced are going to be either convinced or burned. So it's unfortunate, but I can just see that this thing has to play out a bit further, and the stakes have to go a bit more grave before we actually collectively are forced to invest in this. So, yeah, I suppose to quote Bob Dylan, it's hard rain.
Thank you so much for the conversation this evening. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Graeme, Jenny, and Richard. Thanks to Verity Lane Market for hosting us this evening, and to my wonderful colleagues Jackie, Hayden, Eleanor, and Lucci for their help tonight making the event happen. We'll be back here next month on Wednesday, October 18, same time, same place, to chat with Kieran Pender from the Human Rights Law Centre and Richard Dennis to talk about the Whistleblower Project. And if you want to hear more about that, make sure you're there. Don't forget to head to australiainstitute.org.au to read Climate of the Nation 2023 and to sign up to our newsletter and to get all of the updates for Australia Institute events. Subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money, anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you can, like I said at the beginning, we love hosting these events, and if you can help us continue to host them by chipping in, we've got a tap and go point at the back, a donation box. Anything you can contribute goes a long way. Thanks so much for coming tonight, and we'll see you next time.
How about a big round of applause for Liz, who wrote the report?
Thanks, Richard. Thanks so much. See you next time.